So in the first part of this lecture, we learned how Beethoven showed us how we can take a 5/7 chord and then resolve it in a way that we don't expect by interpreting it as a German 6/5. So he introduced us to this unusual or unexpected resolution of a 5/7 chord. Today, in this last video, we're going to look at how some later Romantic composers use that same type of progression, but then use it in a much more romantic context. So that's one that has more dissonance and has a less stable sense of key. So the example I'd like to share with you is a brief passage from Kindertotenlieder by Gustav Mahler. Let me just briefly give a background for this song before I play you an excerpt. I should warn you now that this is not a happy background. This is going to be a sad story. So in 1833 to 1834, the poet Rückert wrote a series of poems called Kindertotenlieder, that is the Song of Dead Children. And he wrote it to express his mourning after he lost both of his daughters. He did not intend for the poems to be published. He really intended it as just a private expression of his deep anguish and grief. But then after his death, the poems were published in 1871, many years later. In 1901 to 1904, Mahler selected 5 of these poems from Rückert's collection and set them for voice and orchestra. Mahler himself had just recently had a baby girl when he wrote these poems, and his wife Alma Mahler was horrified that he was writing this set of songs about losing one's child. And she said, what are you doing? You're tempting Providence by writing these poems. And unfortunately, Alma Mahler was right. A couple years after writing these songs, Mahler himself lost a daughter to disease, and he was, as you can imagine, stricken by grief as well. And he later said to a friend, "If I knew what it was actually like to lose a child, I could not write this piece." So he really learned for himself too what it was like. But for now, we'll look at one of these poems. Please turn to page 8 in your course pack. And this is an excerpt from the Nun sehe ich wohl, warum so dunkle Flammen. That is, Now I See Well, Why with Such Dark Flames, which is one of the songs from this song cycle. This describes the poet looking at his child who has what looks like this light or this flame in his eye. And he realizes that, this flame kind of has this desire to rise up to heaven. And so it's a reflection on just this morning of, the fact that already in the eyes of his child, he sees this this tendency to kind of depart, even though the child is saying with these eyes too, I wish I could stay here with you. I'm going to play this excerpt that's on your page. It's on pages 9 and 10. And I'd like for you to listen to one thing. Where do you hear this kind of augmented sixth type of resolution? So you're going to hear something that sounds like this. Sorry, let me get you closer to the piano here. You're going to hear something that sounds like this. And something like this. Listen for those types of progression in this piece. I will now play this for you. And so on. Let's take a look at just some of the details of voice leading and what keys are implied in that music that we just heard. We won't have time to look at every single chord, but I did want to give you a sense of how later Romantic composers, just imaginatively reinterpreted and reused these kinds of progressions that we were introduced to in the Beethoven Violin Concerto. So here's the opening of the progression, of the excerpt, excuse me. So we begin with a suggestion of C major. That sounds like a dominant of C major. Okay, but then and that dominant is embellished with some neighbor notes. So rather than this, we have, and also that neighbor to that G in that voice. Ya, ya, da, 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 and so forth. And then there's a resolution to 1, but that 1 is has this unresolved neighbor whose resolution is kind of delayed for several chords, something like this. And so forth. So we have something like a 1 maybe that then leads to this 2 chord here. So it's kind of like the resolution is deflected to lead to this 2 chord instead. And then the 2 chord itself has that D resolves that G sharp into A, and that A becomes part of this altered dominant chord, or maybe this altered sort of 7 diminished 7. And we get the resolution there, and so forth. All right. And another feature of this style is that you can have dominant chords that point to a key, even if we never hear the tonic. So in other words, tonics can be implied for long periods of time, even if they never actually sound. And that's something that happens in Beethoven and earlier classical composers too. But for later Romantic composers, very often writing harmony became this game of how long can I sort of point at this key and sustain these unstable 5 harmonies without actually resolving them. So we hear an example of that in this, we hear an example of that in the second system of page 9 of your excerpt. So remember that we're in the key of C major, and here we have, that's maybe like a 5 of 5. Notice that that's a plain old D major chord. Excuse me. Sorry. And then here, sounds like here we have, that sounds like a German 6/5 going to a cadential 6/4. Okay, and so what we might expect is something like a resolution like that. But this, of course, the song is much more anguished and unstable than that. So rather than getting a resolution of that 5 chord points to the key of C major, but then it kind of dissipates and becomes something else. Here's what it becomes. I'll start on that cadential 6/4, the second measure in your on screen, and then second system of your score pack. And there we go to this like applied 7 diminished 7, or applied neighboring chord above that G, on top of that beat G pedal. So we haven't resolved yet. And then we invert that dominant chord right there. That E natural is a neighbor note, so we have a 5/4/3, and then our resolution is deflected into this. It becomes this D flat 7 instead. Now we could think of that as like an altered dominant chord. If you're a jazz musician, you might think of it as a tritone substitution. Or you can think of it as just, Mahler using chromatic voice leading to kind kind of take that chord somewhere else and prepare a new key. Kind of like how earlier, we saw those examples of fully diminished seventh chords being used to move between keys in other compositions. So where does this D flat 7 go? It goes to a B flat dominant seventh chord. So maybe this D flat major chord was something like a flat 7, which is a mixture chord, that now goes to a B flat dominant seventh chord. So maybe now Mahler's briefly suggesting the key of E flat major. And then of course he has one more trick up his sleeve. He's not going to treat this B flat dominant seventh as a 5 after all. What does he do instead? I'll play from the second measure on your screen on page 9. It's System 3, Measure 3. Okay, so in other words, we go from here to here. We're using that same progression we heard in Beethoven. We were treating that B flat dominant seventh chord as a German 6-5 to lead to the cadential 6-4 in the key of D major. And we sort of sit on that with that 5 in the bass. That would be called a 5 pedal. And we have like this heavenly music of depicting this, star-like glowing in the child's eyes, saying, "I wish I could stay here a little bit longer." I won't show you the rest of the score on the screen, but you have the score pack yourself. You might just look at the score and briefly ask yourself, does that 5 of D major resolve to D major, or do we just have the same thing as before? Do we point toward D major with this 5 chord and then go somewhere else? As you can guess, the answer is probably the latter. Go ahead and listen again and look at the score if you wish. All right, so there's a brief example of how later composers use that same unexpected resolution of a 5-7 chord to avoid tonal resolution and to point toward keys without actually ever resolving to them. That's all for now. And the double agent there is reminding you that no matter which side you're on and no matter which key you're in, please be sure to take the quiz on Canvas, and please be sure to complete Part Writing and Analysis Assignment 7, which is also available on Canvas. You can do it on MuseScore and then upload your file on the assignment page. Thank you, everyone. Congratulations, you survived your first week of online teaching. I hope you are all well. Bye-bye.